April 12, 1945. Fort Sam Houston, Texas. The bus doors hissed open, and the first thing that hit them wasn't the heat, wasn't the barbed wire gleaming in the dawn light. It was the smell. Bacon. Real bacon, thick and salty, curling through the morning air like a memory from another lifetime. The German nurses sat frozen in their seats, hands gripping worn medical bags, uniforms stiff with weeks of travel and fear. One whispered a single word. Fleisch. Meat. The others said nothing, but their eyes told the same story. This couldn't be real. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable moment, if you're finding this story as powerful as we do, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss these forgotten chapters of history. And drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. These stories matter, and your support keeps them alive. The youngest among them, a nurse named Erica, pressed her palm against the glass window, watching American soldiers move casually past the mess hall entrance. She had been told to expect brutality, humiliation, perhaps execution. Instead, the air smelled like Sunday mornings before the war, before rationing turned bread into sawdust and soup into colored water. And in that moment, staring at the smoke rising from the kitchen chimneys, she realized something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Everything she had been taught about the enemy might have been a lie. The journey to this realization had begun weeks earlier, in the chaos of a collapsing Reich. These weren't frontline soldiers, they were Red Cross nurses, captured near the Austrian border as Allied forces swept through what remained of German defenses. They had spent months in field hospitals where bandages were boiled and reused until they fell apart, where morphine was a fantasy, where surgeons operated by candlelight because there was no fuel for generators. One nurse, Hilda, had watched a 16-year-old boy die from an infection that penicillin could have cured in days. But penicillin existed only in stories, in whispered rumors of Allied medicine that seemed too miraculous to be true. The train that took them to the port had rolled through the skeleton of Germany. Hamburg was ash and twisted metal. Berlin was a moonscape of craters. In every city, the same sight repeated: women digging through rubble, children with hollow eyes, old men staring at nothing. The nurses had believed, because they had to believe, that everyone was suffering equally, that the Americans and British were also starving, also burying their cities, also watching their children forget what fruit tasted like. The propaganda had been clear. Germany was losing, yes, but the enemy was bleeding just as badly. They crossed the Atlantic in the cargo hold of a Liberty ship, surrounded by returning wounded and supplies heading back for repairs. The voyage took 11 days. 11 days of thin soup and harder bread, of sleeping on canvas stretched between metal ribs, of wondering what waited on the other shore. Some of the women prayed, others wrote letters they weren't allowed to send. Marta, who had grown up in Dresden, sat with her back against the hull and tried to remember the last time she'd felt warm. The cold wasn't just physical, it was the cold of defeat, of knowing your world had ended while you were still breathing. When they arrived in Virginia, processed through a military depot where clerks spoke English so quickly it sounded like machine gun fire, the nurses expected the worst. They were enemy aliens, citizens of a nation that had unleashed horror across Europe. Surely vengeance would follow. But the processing was efficient, almost boring. Forms, photos, medical checks that were more thorough than anything they'd received in their own army for the past 2 years. One American nurse, noticing how thin they were, brought extra sandwiches during the medical screening. White bread, real butter, a slice of cheese that tasted like something from a dream. That was the first crack in the wall. The bus ride from the depot to Texas took 36 hours, rolling through landscapes so vast and untouched that they seemed like propaganda films in reverse. No bomb craters, no burned-out tanks rusting in fields, no cities reduced to hollow teeth against the sky. Instead, farms with painted barns, towns with lit windows, gas stations where civilians pumped fuel without ration cards. Erica watched a woman walk out of a store carrying a bag of groceries, laughing with a friend, and felt something close to rage. How could life simply continue here, ordinary and whole, while Europe burned? But the rage couldn't survive what came next. When the bus pulled through the gates of Fort Sam Houston's POW compound at dawn, the camp was already awake. Soldiers moved between buildings with the casual efficiency of men who'd slept in real beds and eaten real meals. The perimeter was lined with wire, yes, and guard towers stood at each corner, but the camp itself looked less like a prison and more like a military base. Wooden barracks painted white, gravel paths swept clean, latrines that didn't reek, and that impossible, devastating smell of bacon frying in industrial kitchens designed to feed hundreds. The guards who met them were professional, almost bored. No shouting, no rifles shoved in faces. Just tired men doing a job, gesturing for the women to form a line. One guard, an older man with corporal stripes, handed Hilda a tin cup of coffee without a word. She stared at it, convinced it was a test or a trick. But he just moved down the line, handing out more cups, and when she finally sipped it bitter, hot, real, her hands started shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. They were led to the processing building where an American officer, speaking slow German, explained the camp rules. They would be housed separately from male POWs. They would be given work assignments, likely in the camp infirmary. They would be allowed to write home once a week, letters subject to censorship. They would receive the same rations as American personnel, adjusted for availability. And then he said something that made several of them exchange glances of pure disbelief. If you have any medical needs, report them. We have sufficient supplies. Sufficient supplies. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. After processing came the barracks' long wooden structures with rows of metal frame beds, thin mattresses, and folded blankets stacked at each footboard. A German-speaking sergeant, a woman with tired eyes and an Illinois accent, showed them the washrooms. Running water, soap that smelled like lavender, towels that were clean. Not repurposed flour sacks or torn uniforms, but actual towels, woven and soft. Marta ran her fingers over one, then sat heavily on a bench, staring at her hands. She'd spent 6 months in field hospitals where they washed surgical instruments in snow. And here, in a prison camp, there was soap. Breakfast that first morning nearly broke them. The mess hall was a long building, humming with the sound of 300 men eating, talking, existing. The German women were directed to a separate section, but they could see everything: the serving line, the kitchen, the waste bins where American soldiers scraped half-finished plates of food that would have fed a German family for a week. When the servers filled their trays, the nurses stood frozen. Scrambled eggs, golden and steaming, toast, thick and buttered, beans and tomato sauce, a mug of milk, and between two of them, as if it were nothing, 3 strips of bacon. Hilda stared at her plate, then at Erica, then back at the bacon. She'd been eating sawdust bread and cabbage soup for so long that her body had forgotten what meat felt like. The smell alone made her dizzy, not just hunger, but memory. Sundays before the war, when her father would cook breakfast while her mother read the paper. When food was normal, when the world made sense. She picked up a strip, grease shining on her fingers, and bit into it. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt, smoke, fat, richness, and she had to close her eyes because tears were coming and she refused to cry in front of the guards. But when she opened them again, Erica was crying anyway, silently, chewing slowly, and neither of them could speak. Because this wasn't just food, this was evidence. Evidence that the enemy had abundance while their own people starved. Evidence that the war had been lost long before the battles ended. Evidence that everything had been a lie. The other women ate in similar silence, each processing the same brutal arithmetic. Back home, their families were trading wedding rings for flour. Here, in a camp for prisoners, there was bacon at breakfast. Not once, not as a special occasion, but routinely, casually, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Later, in the barracks, someone finally spoke, It was Marta, her voice low and raw. "My sister's last letter said they were boiling potato peels, and we just ate bacon." No one replied. What was there to say? But the contradictions had only begun. By the second week, the nurses had been assigned to the camp infirmary, a clean, well-lit building that would have been the envy of any hospital in Germany. The head medical officer, a captain named Morrison, walked them through on their first day, explaining procedures in careful, slow English, while a translator followed behind. He showed them supply closets stocked with bandages, syringes, antiseptic, sulfa drugs, and then he opened a locked cabinet and gestured casually at rows of small glass vials. Penicillin. Erica actually gasped. She'd seen penicillin exactly twice during the entire war, both times reserved for high-ranking officers with connections. Here, it was organized by batch number, stacked in refrigerated storage, logged on clipboards like any other medication. Morrison noticed her reaction and frowned slightly. "Is there a problem?" he asked in English. The translator converted it. Erica shook her head, unable to explain that she'd just seen more penicillin in a prison infirmary than existed in most German field hospitals combined. The work itself was familiar cleaning instruments, changing bedding, assisting with minor procedures, but the context was surreal. They were prisoners treating prisoners, under the supervision of the enemy, using supplies their own side could never provide. One afternoon, Hilda was ordered to help change the dressing on a German soldier's infected leg wound. The man had been captured in France, transferred through 3 camps, and was now recovering from surgery that had saved his leg. He looked up at her with hollow eyes and whispered, "They're feeding us better than our own officers did." She wanted to tell him to be quiet, that such talk was dangerous, but she knew he was right. The American staff treated them professionally, not warmly, but without cruelty. The nurses, some white, some black, gave orders and expected them to be followed, and that was that. But it was the black nurses who caused the most profound internal conflict. The German women had been raised on Nazi propaganda that painted non-white people as subhuman, inferior, incapable of civilization. Yet here was Lieutenant Cooper, a black woman with a nursing degree, directing medical procedures with calm authority, her competence undeniable, her bearing dignified. She caught Hilda staring once and raised an eyebrow. "Something you need, ma'am?" The question was polite but firm, the tone of someone used to being underestimated. Hilda stammered an apology and returned to her work, but the moment stayed with her. Every lie unraveling, one interaction at a time. At night, the women gathered in their barracks and spoke in whispers, as if the truth itself were contraband. They compared notes, the food, the medicine, the casual efficiency of American logistics. Someone mentioned that the guards had a radio playing music during their shifts. Another had seen a magazine left on a bench, showing advertisements for cars and refrigerators and vacuum cleaners, as if the war were a distant inconvenience. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. This was supposed to be the enemy. This was supposed to be the nation of gangsters and plutocrats that the Reich would crush beneath its boot. Instead, it was a machine so vast, so productive, so utterly beyond Germany's capacity, that the war's outcome had never been in doubt. Marta said it aloud one night, her voice barely audible. "We never had a chance, did we?" Silence. Then Erica, staring at the ceiling. "No, we never did." The letters they were allowed to send home were carefully worded, scrubbed clean of anything that might sound like praise for their captors. But even in code, the women tried to communicate the impossible. Hilda wrote to her mother, "We are treated fairly. We have enough to eat. Do not worry for me." What she couldn't write was the rest that she ate better behind barbed wire than her mother did in Hamburg, that she slept in a bed with a mattress, that the infirmary had more medicine than the Charité hospital had seen in 2 years. When replies came, they were devastating. Her mother's letters spoke of hunger, of neighbors vanishing, of children begging for crumbs. One said they had eaten a cat. Hilda read it 3 times, folded it, and walked outside to stare at the Texas sky. A guard asked if she was all right. She nodded, unable to explain that she was mourning not only her family's suffering, but the truth it had all been for nothing. For a regime built on lies. For leaders who sent millions to die while promising victory that was never possible. Rumors spread German POWs in other states were working on farms, earning wages, even dining with Americans on holidays. At first, the nurses dismissed it as fantasy, until a guard mentioned that men in Louisiana were paid in camp scrip. Paid. For work. While prisoners. The idea was incomprehensible. One Sunday, a chaplain preached about mercy, about treating captives with dignity. His words felt dangerous, contradicting everything the Reich had taught. Afterward, Erica asked why America treated prisoners so well. The chaplain said, "Because we want to prove our way is better not through force, but through example." That answer haunted her. It wasn't kindness for kindness' sake, it was strategy. Every full plate, every clean infirmary, every letter home was a weapon aimed at fascism. And it worked. By summer, life felt almost normal. Dawn, infirmary, abundant meals, letters widening the gulf between their lives and their families. Even the Texas heat was managed with fans and water breaks. The American obsession with order extended even to comfort. One afternoon, Hilda offered a medical suggestion. Captain Morrison listened, nodded, and said, "You're a good nurse. It's a shame the war wasted you." She returned to work, the word wasted echoing in her mind. Her training, her service all wasted for a rotten cause. Contradictions piled up. The food, the logistics, the inclusion of black soldiers and nurses, the fairness. America's strength came not from cruelty but from efficiency and production. Germany's had come from myth. When news of surrender came in May, the nurses stood silent. Some cried. Marta whispered, "It's over." Without relief. Now the question was not survival, but return. Repatriation began that summer. They dreaded it. After months of abundance, they faced rubble and hunger again. Returning POWs were branded traitors. How could they explain the smell of bacon without sounding like collaborators? When Hilda asked Morrison what awaited them, he said gently, "It won't be easy." She already knew. What she didn't know was whether she could bear to go back to a graveyard. On their final morning, the nurses packed their meager belongings. Erica stood by the fence remembering bacon, penicillin, respect. When a guard asked if she was ready, she said, "Thank you for treating us like human beings." He shuffled awkwardly. "War's over. Good luck out there." Their ship to Europe was crowded with refugees and POWs. Bremerhaven was rubble. Processing dragged on. Released with ration cards that meant little, Hilda made her way to Hamburg. Her home was gone. Her family lived in a church basement. When they reunited, her mother asked, "Were they cruel?" Hilda hesitated. "No, they fed us, gave us medicine, treated us fairly." Her mother looked away. "Don't tell anyone, they'll think you're a traitor." So she stayed silent. The stories of abundance became secrets whispered only among those who understood. Admitting that the enemy had shown them humanity was dangerous. But the memory endured. Decades later, Erica told her granddaughter about the war, the hospitals, the collapse, the capture. Then she said softly, "I'll never forget the smell of bacon. That was the moment I knew we'd been lied to." "Were you angry?" her granddaughter asked. "No," Erica said, "heartbroken, because all the suffering ours and theirs had been for nothing. The people who saw through it were the ones feeding us." The story of the German nurses at Fort Sam Houston isn't about American virtue or German victimhood. It's about how a nation's strength shows and how it treats those it defeats. Propaganda collapses when faced with lived truth. The smell of bacon in a Texas camp was never just about food. It was proof that cruelty isn't strength, that mercy, even strategic mercy, can win wars minds never could. Those nurses carried that truth home, silent but unforgotten. that behind enemy wire they had been treated as human beings, and that, more than any bomb, marked the true end of the world they once believed in.